Hello and welcome to a special Saturday edition of Coffee House Shots. The Grenfell Tower fire of June 2017 killed 72 people and exposed deficiencies in the building safety regime under which millions of homes have been made. The number of residents estimated to be affected by safety breaches in the type of cladding or related fire safety breaches used on their buildings is around 760,000. These residents find themselves trapped in homes that are rendered worthless, often facing eye-watering bills for fire safety, while a blame game gets underway as to who should fit the final bill. This week, the government announced a £3.5 billion fund to fix dangerous cladding on high-rise buildings in England. But what does it cover, and does it go far enough? To discuss this, I'm joined by the Spectator's Emma Byrne, personally affected by the cladding crisis, and Bob Blackman, Conservative MP for Harrow East and a member of the Housing Select Committee. Bob, to start us off, before we get into the details of how this impacts everyone and what else the government can do, could you talk listeners through ultimately what was announced this week and what it is in response to?
Okay, well, to start with, obviously the government had announced 600 million to remediate the unsafe cladding on socially rented accommodation, and then a further £1 billion to do the privately owned blocks. The announcement this week is a further 3.5 billion to remediate the unsafe cladding on high-rise buildings. In other words, that's any building or any home that is more than 6 stories high. And I'll come back to what happens to below that in a minute. So that's what the fund of 3.5 billion is there to do. The government's also announced a wholesale shake-up of the regulation of tall buildings and the building industry. This means that there will be proper regulation of both the planning application stage and also making sure that people build what they got planning permission for, that they use the materials they should be using and that they don't cut corners. This is very important because we know that in a number of instances that was not the case and people have cut corners, they've used unsafe material. And finally, of course, the issue in terms of the tall buildings is to make sure that no leaseholder is going to have to contribute towards those costs, which is, after all, what we were aiming for. Now, what the government haven't done is deal with other fire safety issues in relation to tall buildings. And maybe we can explore that a bit further. In terms of the medium rise blocks, these are 6 stories or under. The risk is far lower. And they've done a risk assessment basis. And so therefore, what they've decided to do is to basically advance loans to the leaseholders in those blocks, such that the loan would be against the building as opposed against the leaseholder. And the leaseholder would only pay a maximum of £50 a month on their service charge towards the costs of remediating the cladding. Now, a lot of the detail of this has to be examined. And I have to say, I'm really pleased with what the government's done on high-rise buildings. I reserve judgment at the moment till we see the full detail of the medium-rise buildings. I have to say, I've sat through so many inquiries now and so much detail. And I think the tragedy that happened at Grenfell, what we do know is that actually it's only by luck that other buildings have not suffered the same fate as Grenfell. So it's vital that we actually get on with this work and get it completed.
Emma, you are a senior journalist at The Spectator, but the reason we have you on today's podcast is not for the work you're doing in the organisation, but the fact that you were affected by the cladding crisis. So I just wanted to begin, could you just explain, I suppose, if we're rewinding the hands of time, to when you first realised ultimately that your building had combustible cladding that was not deemed safe, and two, that it was apparently your problem?
Yeah, so at the beginning of last year, sales in my building started falling through. At that point, I didn't know there was an issue. Then began talking to neighbours and found out about the EWS1 form and basically discovered that our building is covered in potentially risky cladding. At that point, we hadn't had kind of invasive tests, so we didn't know. So I had months and months of worry about, is it safe? Is it going to pass? Is it not? In October, on my birthday as it happens, we discovered that the cladding had failed all fire safety tests. There are also a host of other problems with the building. We were given a B2 rating. An immediate waking watch was imposed, which is when fire marshals patrol your property 24 hours a day so that if it catches fire, they basically rouse you from your beds at night and shepherd you out. This is costing around £30,000 a month. Luckily, my housing association, because I'm a shared owner, are currently paying for that, but there is still the worry that that could potentially fall on leaseholders in the future if they don't pay for it, which could be hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month on top of all our mortgage costs. And yeah, we're just kind of waiting, really. My building is 4 years old, so we have a lot more kind of legal avenues to explore. There's something called the Defective Premises Act, which if your building is older than 6 years old, you have very little legal leeway to actually put defects right. But we potentially do have some avenues. And I did on Wednesday find out that because my building is over 80 metres, I will be liable for government funding for cladding. However, I could still be hit by a bill of tens and tens of thousands of pounds if those fire safety defects are not covered. So it's still an incredibly worrying time for me.
And Bob, a lot of people listening to this, and I think previously who have been following this, have asked why, if it is no fault of the people living in these flats who bought the flats, would they suddenly get the bill when it clearly wasn't up to them what cladding was used? And at the time, they didn't really have much reason to think or check this. So what do you think the dilemma the government has on this is? Ultimately, is it too difficult to get the developers to go back and do it? What is the reason that it is becoming such a difficult process for the government?
It's a grossly unfair position that leaseholders get burdened with huge bills, or any bill at all, effectively, for something that they didn't cause in the first place, and indeed is now being discovered. I think one of the concerns I have is to say, look, at some stage, someone said that this building, when it was put up, accorded with the building regulations at the time. Now, here the challenge is, if the building was put up in line with the building regulations and someone signed it off, then it's the building regulations that are at fault. And therefore, under those circumstances, I'm afraid the liability has to fall on the government and the taxpayer for the fact that the building regulations were incorrect. However, if we're in a position, and a lot of the evidence from Grenfell is that the building was put up and it wasn't in accordance with building regulations, and in fact the judge ruled that the cladding was unsafe and illegal. If those are the cases, then it's quite clear where you go back to, and that is the people that built the building in the first place and were responsible for signing off that this building was in accordance with building regulations. So it is a complicated position, but it's not just that. There's fire safety doors, there's lifts, there's other elements within buildings which are now deemed to be unsafe. And the issue is, did they accord with building regulations at the time? Because it's grossly unfair that we're going to get to a point whereby leaseholders could get huge bills for that. And the estimate, by the way, the estimate of that work will be an extra between 6 and 10 billion pounds to put right all of those defects. And the issue then is, how is that going to be paid for?
Emma, when it comes to others affected by this, you have been, I think, speaking to others affected. There's been an effort to have a group response. So what do you think the general feelings are in terms of how the government has handled this so far? Because I think one of the problems for the government is that ultimately the Tory party is often seen as a party which is ultimately saying, great property owning democracy. And people say you start to think about voting Conservative once you move from renting to perhaps having a mortgage. But yet it does feel as though in this case, probably a lot of people feel quite disillusioned about that process.
So I'm a member of the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign, which brings together all the kind of localised cladding groups as one. We are pretty disappointed. I know a lot of people were in absolute tears after the announcement by Robert Jenrick in the Commons on Wednesday. For a start, this kind of arbitrary height limit that's come in. People under 18 metres, in buildings under 18 metres, nothing changes for them. They are still being hit by enormous watching bills, enormous insurance hike bills, and they're now being told that they are, it's being limited to £50 a month, but they are still being told that they have to pay for other people's mistakes. And the general kind of sense is real kind of devastation and real anger. Mr. Blackman says, the testing wasn't fit for purpose. This has been, the government retrospectively changed legislation. Manufacturers have rigged safety tests. Developers have built shoddy properties. And yet we are being told that, yes, we all recognise that, but basically you have to stump up. And there was a recent survey by Inside Housing looked at people caught in this crisis, how it's going to vote, 83% say it's absolutely going to affect how they vote in the future. It's especially as, this £50 bill is a constant reminder that they have been kind of betrayed. We all bought properties in good faith, spent a lot of money on experts who signed these offers safe, and we've been sold a pup. And, I know that there is a developer levy, 200 million a year, which is going to raise 2 billion over 10 years. But quite frankly, it's a token gesture. The taxpayer is spending 30 billion in help to buy subsidies at the moment. Why corporate welfare for developers, but nothing for under 18-metre leaseholders?
Bob, do you worry about the impact this is having on the reputation of the Conservative Party amongst those affected?
Well, I think, listen, I've got every sympathy with people who at the moment, just as Emma's saying, will not necessarily feel they've been helped or supported. Every sympathy. I think the key point here is this is a huge stride forward to fix the tall buildings, which are the riskiest area of all. And what we're into here is making sure that people have a safe home in which to live and that they're not paying for the cost of that. And that's why I say that we've got to look at this, the medium to low rise issue, in further detail. But I think we should be looking at, we made a huge step forward. This is not the end of the dealing with the issue, but it is fixing the worst affected areas in terms of the biggest risk.
And in terms of, I suppose, where the cost should go, if it is proving, and Bob outlined some of the reasons that it's hard to obviously ensure that companies will necessarily step in, some are no longer around, it's a long process. The cost at the moment clearly is going on leaseholders. There's a movement that way. Do you think a scenario where actually this just went generally on taxpayers would be preferable to what's currently being suggested, if it is hard to get the money coming from, the places that we might first think are the most obvious?
So as a campaign group, we've always said that because, exactly like Bob said, this is an incredibly complicated situation with so many people involved, certain liabilities, etc. The only way to get this fixed, and quickly, because, not to do too bad a pun, but the government is literally playing with fire and hoping there isn't another Grenfell, that the government needs to put all the money up front immediately and then work out how to get the money back from the various players. It's all about time now and helping people as quickly as possible. The taxpayer issue as well. I'd like to quickly, that there seems to always be a division about taxpayers or leaseholders. Just to make it quite clear, we are taxpayers. I pay my taxes. I spent a lot of money in stamp duty. We're also paying VAT on waking watches, and we'll be paying a huge amount on the remedial bill with VAT. Quite a lot of money from the cost of repairing our buildings that we're going to be paying for is going to be going back into the Chancellor's pockets. I just hate the division, like that it's either one or the other. We are taxpayers as well.
Yeah, listen, I've got every sympathy with the leaseholders and have done from the word go. They're the ones trapped in the middle of all this, and clearly there's concern. I think the first point to make here is that the government overall has stepped up to the mark to provide some of the funding that is required to fix these problems. By no means all. I think what we've got to be careful of is what sort of unlimited pot are we going to be drawing on in terms of the funding. So I think we should welcome what has been done by the government this week, particularly on high-rise buildings. The issue around an arbitrary height, well, that came from Dame Judith Hackett's review of the industry, and she made very clear from the word go that on a risk-based approach, buildings above 6 stories were the highest risk and therefore needed urgent action. Buildings below 6 stories, it is possible that for people to get out of those buildings in case of a fire, it's possible for people to feel perfectly safe within those buildings and not have the same problems as in high-rise buildings. So it's a risk-based approach. Now, you have to listen to the professionals in this regard. Equally, we also have to look at the total amount of money that could be involved here. If we're looking at potentially £15 billion for all the costs for everyone to fix all these residential buildings, doesn't touch the other buildings, commercial buildings, hospitals, schools, etc., where potentially unsafe cladding is on those buildings as well. If that cost falls on the taxpayer, how is that going to be funded is going to be the issue going forward, which the Treasury have to wrestle with. My concern is making sure that the buildings are safe and secure, And actually, we end the uncertainty for leaseholders, because the other problem is that people have been stuck in buildings, not sure if they're safe or not sure if they're going to be remediated, not sure who's going to be paying for it, not sure whether they're going to be able to sell their properties or not going forward. And other people are coming along saying, well, I'm not going to buy that because it's too big a risk. So the property market has been frozen up as a direct result of this. I think this gives a degree of certainty over what's going to happen. One of my other concerns, and I'll end with this, is that since Grenfell, we've had more buildings put up. They've also have safety defects on them, even after Grenfell. We've had planning permissions granted and developments starting and taking place. And making sure those buildings are all safe is a critical part of all of this as we go forward. So all new buildings should be inherently safe. It's then we have to deal with the backlog of older buildings to make sure they're brought back into a safe measure at which leaseholders can feel comfortable that they're safe in a safe building and they're not paying the price.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Emma. And thank you for listening. And this will not be the last we hear of the cladding debate, with a Tory rebellion looming on the issue. So do stay tuned for the following twists and turns.